I have some really bad timing. Last time I did one of these, it was for a game called Beneath a Steel Sky, and I discovered that Chris Asick over on Pixel Musement had just released an Ancient DOS Games review about it. This time round, I'm doing a random talk about Star Trek: A Final Unity, only to discover that my friend Angel over on his site has done an extensive review and talk about Star Trek: A Final Unity. Fortunately, Angel's one of my friends and this worked to my advantage, because he gave me all the footage of his playthrough. If you want to see his playthrough of the game in full, and a review after, it's all linked in the description. Though I urge you, please listen to my thoughts instead, even though he knows more about Star Trek: The Next Generation and Final Unity than I do. What's the point of this again? So to a certain set of individuals, Star Trek: The Next Generation is the greatest science fiction series of all time. For other people like myself, we take it that little bit further. Star Trek: The Next Generation is probably the best TV series of all time. I'm fairly sure when I was a small child back in the 80s, my parents would have Star Trek: The Next Generation on live. So technically I watched it the first time round. A Final Unity is a point-and-click adventure game released shortly after Star Trek: The Next Generation finished, and was created by Spectrum Holobyte, who are more well known for their flight simulator games. Though it's obvious to anyone who's watched the TV show and played the game that somebody at Spectrum Holobyte had a lot of love for Star Trek: The Next Generation. A Final Unity isn't actually the first Star Trek game by Spectrum Holobyte. Instead, they decided to release a game on the SNES, of all things, which didn't really lend itself to Star Trek in general, but hey, apparently it's a decent game, so they honed their skills, I guess, and then decided, hey, let's utilize a real computer. Yes, SNES fans, I said it, a real computer. And make a great Star Trek game. And that's what they ended up doing with A Final Unity. You often find that with developers. They have a title that initially is them cutting their teeth and figuring things out, and then when they figured things out and try it again, it's like, oh, all this groundwork stuff that we needed to do before doesn't exist. We can just go straight to making a good game and refining the bits we didn't like. And by refining the bits they didn't like, they meant shamelessly copying Interplay. Yep, that's right, the creative geniuses at Interplay, a team that I lavish praise upon all the time on this channel, had access to the Star Trek license and the Star Trek voice actors, and made a 25th anniversary point-and-click celebration of the original series, and followed it up with an equally well-received Judgment Right sequel. So Spectrum Holobyte essentially said, hey, anything they can do, we can do better, and went about acquiring the rights for The Next Generation, acquiring the entire cast of The Next Generation, minus Will Wheaton, and minus Whoopi Goldberg because they probably couldn't afford her at that point. Oh, and Denise Crosby, but we know why she wasn't there. And they said to themselves, hey, we've got better technology than Interplay did back then. Why don't we utilize all this high color and SVGA graphics and so on, and really do justice to the world of Star Trek in a way that hasn't before. So instead of going for the cartoonish aesthetic of the previous point-and-click adventure games, they decided to have a more realistic approach to both the way the bridge looked, the way the characters looked, and the general world. This improved the immersion tenfold. It wasn't perfect, there were certain bits that stick out more than others, but for the most part they did well. Much like the Interplay games, the big selling point of A Final Unity is that it was a new adventure for the Next Generation crew. There had only been one movie out to my knowledge. I think Generations came out after A Final Unity, not before. I might be wrong about that. Some Trek fan in the comments can correct me, probably Angel. The series had wrapped up, so the idea of getting a unique adventure that fits in with the star dates of the Next Gen series, it starts at the start of Season 7, I believe, was really enticing to Trek fans. And because the TV series had just ended, most of the cast were at the peak of their acting powers. They had played these parts for 7 years, and they didn't feel like they were reading off a script or phoning it in. Somebody must have told them, hey, those Interplay games sold well. Actually put in a bit of effort. This isn't some cash grab tie-in. Unlike your standard point-and-click adventure game, you actually start on the bridge of the Enterprise, with the now standard view that the TV series had, with Jean-Luc Picard front and center and all his various officers that he can discuss things with and talk to and essentially get suggestions from. From there you have the ability to navigate to different parts of the ships, or you can open healing frequencies with other people, or even discuss things with visitors to your ships in the conference room. And there's always the transporters when you find yourself orbiting a planet. And there's a background detail towards the engineering section and so on that's delivered in an LCARS style that is true to the show. As the gameplay progresses, more and more parts of the ship open up, but you still have that home hub feel of the Enterprise that isn't always in point-and-click adventure games, so it makes for a nice little addition. When people watched the show, they had this sort of homely feeling about the Galaxy-class starship, like you could live there comfortably. And if Picard gets really lost about his mission, he has the option to contact Starfleet and ask them, what's going on? What am I meant to do? What's happening? The view screen itself is just like the show. You have Picard with a series of questions that he can ask the individual, and there's a back and forth repartee between the two people, and it just feels right. Though some of the people you'll be talking to seem to be captured from real-life actors, and others appear to be artist renderings, which is a bit of an inconsistency. I'm not entirely sure why they did that, but hey, it's not that big a deal. You can plot coordinates of the Enterprise, you can fly around and engage ships in real-time 3D combat and all that jazz, but on lower difficulty levels, it just lets you play it like a normal point-and-click adventure game. The problem with adding so many additional little bells and whistles is that it doesn't always work very well. And I felt that the navigation and the combat sections of the game were the weakest points. So, patrolling near the neutral zone, the Enterprise comes into contact with a small ship from the Garidians, who are essentially the Romulans but not. It's kind of cheap, it just allows them to use the exact same models as the Romulans, but they seem to have far less animosity towards the Federation. There's no Tomahawk situation right off the get-go. There's these bunch of people that are searching for the ancient fifth scroll or something, and it's an artifact, which means it's involving archaeology, which means Picard is rubbing his hands together and being like, yeah, I like archaeology, let me in on this, I want to know more about this bizarre planet and its scroll and so on. And so the Enterprise flies forth. Well, they don't at first. They have to go to Merton's orbital station, and that's where you learn about away missions. You pick an away team to beam down to the station, and honestly it's just like the show. You see this effect of them beaming down and they end up in this small enclosed part of the station, and it genuinely feels like an episode of Star Trek. And there's a nice little touch about the away teams too. You don't necessarily have to pick all the best people. You can have random crew members. I think there's 2 of them. One's called Karlstrom. I can't remember the name of the other one. I think they were named after developers. And they're just random people, which happened in the shows as well. Especially when somebody on the away mission needed to get killed. Though you'll probably not want to do that to these poor extras. In typical point-and-click fashion, there's a bar at the bottom with your inventory, and it allows you to point and click and interact with things, and anyone who's played a Sierra or LucasArts game, they know what to expect here. It's all very much by the book. There are minor variations that you'll initially have to pick up, but for the most part, your standard point-and-click adventure fan will look at this bit and say, oh, right, a point-and-click adventure game. And it feels like a halfway home between the LucasArts style of, oh, we don't want to kill you ever, and the Sierra style of, oh, we want to kill you all the time you get puzzles wrong. Here, have another death. If you're stupid, you can die. But it's kind of forgiving about it. Generally, crew members can get knocked out, they get thrown about the place, but they don't, get horrifically injured, forcing a beam up and the termination of the mission. And you'll also notice as the station opens up and you visit the first planet, we'll get to that, the art style changes from the original TV series. There's much larger areas, there's much more detailed environments, and much more leeway for the artists to show a certain style of alien architecture that the TV series just didn't have the budget for. This was first done well in the animated series back in the 70s, when they introduced Imres and Arex to the crew. Also different from your standard point-and-click adventure game is that your officers have health, and it can be quite amusing when they get knocked out and incapacitated, and you're desperately trying to scramble around and fix things, and in reality you just have to wait and they'll slowly pick themselves up from the floor. There was one instance in Angel's playthrough where he cycled through to Beverly Crusher and she was like, he's seriously hurt, and it's like, well, do something about it. And then he cycled through to Jordy and he was like, it's Data! Completely ignoring the fact that Data was collapsed in a heap. I spoke about the art style, but it bears repeating again. There's glorious vistas, there's all kinds of strange architecture and bizarre creatures, and somebody was really given free rein. And they were told, just go nuts, go for it, really enjoy yourself. And it's really one of the better parts of the game, because it allows the designers to boldly go where the television series didn't. See what I did there? The only problem with that is that sometimes there's a bit of incongruity, sometimes things clash a little bit and you're like, that doesn't feel like it belongs. 80 to 90% of the time it works. You don't begrudge the other 10%. You'd rather have that than boring, dull, drab backdrops that don't really cause any need to look at them whatsoever. Oh look, it's a wall. I mean, anyone can do that. Unfortunately, in spite of the sound design being true to the show, with all the phaser noises, the voice acting, and the general ambience of the bridge and various other places, there can be spots where the sound is quite frankly annoying. And nowhere is this more typified than Marasia, the first planet that you come to. And you will definitely want to know that you can hold down shift in order to walk quicker, because this zoological disaster of a first level after the tutorial that was Merton's Station is a slog. It's slow, it's annoying, there's a lot of backtracking, and it just doesn't feel like it endears itself to the player much. As with most adventure games, a final Unity also contains puzzles, and you'll find a few on Marasia as well, and some of them are good, others, it happens. It's almost required in the adventure gaming community to have at least one puzzle per game where you're just like, oh no, this is awful. And a final Unity has one or two of those in store for you. Fortunately, we live in a world where FAQs exist, easily accessible online. So if you find yourself bamboozled by a particularly irritating puzzle, you can just go look up the answer, it's not too bad. Or watch a playthrough instead, such as Angel's playthrough, linked in the comments. If you really want to know about the plot, go play the game. Honestly, it's great. It's abandoned as far as I can tell. There's no digital version. Just go download it and give it a try. In hindsight, A Final Unity is one of the best Star Trek games ever made. And one of the things that really endears me to it is that the cast are age appropriate. They're not like the Interplay games where Kirk is 25 years older than he was in the TV shows. The narrative-heavy style and the bridge elements and everything gameplay-wise feels like it suits the next generation to a T. The writing is probably as good as an episode of the Star Trek series itself. because there is pointed social commentary. Okay, so it's not the best, but it's about in line with a lesser Star Trek episode, and you get to interact with the environment, which is pretty cool, I think. The problem comes when you're a point-and-click adventure fan who hasn't seen Star Trek. Would I recommend this? And the answer is maybe, though you'll have to acknowledge that a working understanding of the characters would be a good idea, as the game itself makes no effort to introduce who these characters are. It works under the assumption that people who would buy a Star Trek The Next Generation game have seen some Star Trek The Next Generation. Makes sense, right? I think if you haven't seen Star Trek, it's still a good point-and-click adventure game, but not a great point-and-click adventure game. It's bogged down a little too much by its bad combat mechanics, some of the iffy puzzles, and just not knowing the characters. But ultimately, there hasn't really been a game before or since that has captured that feel of Star Trek The Next Generation quite like a Final Unity did. Speaking of pulling something off, there is a degree of ambition with the open world galaxy and the traveling and the various systems. It feels like they reached a little too much, and the game itself was delayed in production. I feel if it had been a little more focused on just the point and click elements, that it would have, been a stronger story. When you look back in retrospect or hindsight, there's always going to be two camps. There's the people who worship Star Trek and see a Final Unity as this brilliant point-and-click adventure game because they understand its strongest point is how it captured the characters and the atmosphere. And then there's going to be the point-and-click adventure fans who haven't seen Star Trek, and they see this science fiction franchise that they don't really get any of the references to, and they're getting maybe half the story. But even with half the story, they're getting a good point-and-click adventure game for the most part, and it's difficult to reconcile the two groups. Eventually, Spectrum Holobyte consolidated with Microprose and went under the Microprose banner. They released Klingon Honor Guard and Generations, but those weren't adventure games, they were FPS games. The FPS genre doesn't really lend itself to Star Trek as well as the adventure genre does, with the exception of maybe Elite Force. The games they ended up releasing were okay. They weren't bad games, it just felt like, oh, I wish you could have done another point-and-click adventure, before the cast started to get old and had other commitments and just generally didn't want to do it anymore. Ultimately, I think it's a superb game. It has its issues, but it's an episode of The Next Generation, played out in long-form adventuring format, and I really like that. Thankfully, the Star Trek license is in good hands, and we can look forward to many great point-and-click adventure games in the future. Can you imagine if somebody brought the cast back nowadays? Doddering around in their 60s, oh yes, we must save the universe. Ah, right, yeah.